Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Star Trek Deep Space Nine Season 1. This video is part of a series of videos where I review every episode of Star Trek Deep Space Nine, one season at a time. In this video, I will cover all the episodes of Season 1. So, after covering Star Trek Voyager and Babylon 5 with monthly videos that cover every episode in each season, I decided to turn my attention to Deep Space Nine. And my motivations behind doing so are somewhat different. As with Voyager, I thought it was an interesting case study of how the show progresses over each season and presents a rare case in Trek where the earlier seasons were better than the later seasons. And with Babylon 5, I had been bombarded with requests to review that show for years, so I thought it would be fun to revisit it as I had only seen it once 10 years ago. Deep Space Nine, on the other hand, is a show I've seen dozens of times, and I'm intimately familiar with each and every episode. And in contrast to Voyager, Deep Space Nine follows a similar format of The Next Generation and Enterprise, where their first two seasons are their weakest, but it gets better in the later seasons. So I was more compelled to cover all of Deep Space Nine, mainly because, as I mentioned on my channel before, it's my favorite Star Trek show. In fact, I recently did a video where I counted down my top 10 favorite sci-fi fantasy shows of all time, and I had Deep Space Nine listed as my number one favorite sci-fi show of all time, which is a bold statement indeed. Although, to be fair, I'm sure my opinion on this could change depending on the day of the week. But it's not that I think Deep Space Nine is a perfect show, as I think it has many flaws, particularly in its first two seasons, but it's more of, I thought overall it encapsulates everything that I love about Star Trek, but does something Trek has never done before or since, and of course has a large cast of richly dynamic characters, and focuses mainly on character stories, which is what I look for in any show. So I thought it'd be interesting to take a closer look at the show and why I like it so much, and examine the many less than stellar moments of the show, as well as that, so I may change my mind. And we will be interesting to examine each season and how cohesive it is and how well it fits in with the other seasons. Now, like many Trek shows, when it first aired, it received a lot of criticism from Star Trek fans. The most common complaint I heard was that it went against the ethos of Star Trek by setting the show at a stationary location, whereas Star Trek was supposed to be about boldly going into the unknown and exploring. I had a friend at the time that Deep Space Nine was airing who would constantly put it down because of this. He was fond of saying that the original series and The Next Generation were boldly going forward into the unknown, and in Deep Space Nine they stopped and they stood still, and in Voyager they turned around and were going the wrong direction. He obviously meant this as a dig against Deep Space Nine and Voyager, but this never bothered me, because the concept of boldly going into the unknown actually wasn't that appealing to me, as what that tends to mean in practical storytelling terms is that the crew is encountering a different alien of the week every week, and everything is resetting after every episode. And what attracts me most to Star Trek personally was the world building, or shall I say, universe building. It was this tangible universe that was being established through long-term story arcs and recurring themes, such as the establishment of a universe that has superpowers of the Federation, the Romulan Empire, the Klingon Empire, who all have different various ways of relating to one another, and the individual character journeys people would go on, such as Kirk learning to deal with growing old, or Picard dealing with the experience of having a family in another life, and how that affected him. And although both the original series and The Next Generation don't dwell on these aspects very much, it's still what attracted me to them. The concept of having a stationary setting allows Deep Space Nine to really delve into this concept, which is probably why I would say it's the best Star Trek show, because it provides in abundance what I love most about Star Trek, as it introduces and deeply explores a lot of interesting aliens and establishes them as tangible and realistic cultures, unlike the previous Trek shows that focus more on the alien of the week. However, the show has definitely was definitely struggling to find its footing when it first began, because it was setting up an entire different kind of show, which frankly Roddenberry would have been violently against. So it almost makes me feel the timing that this show came out was little than 1 year after his passing was no coincidence. As like many people are saying in modern times about the current Star Trek show, people complained about Deep Space Nine for being too dark, and that was against the ethos of Star Trek, which was always bright and about an optimistic future. But despite the fact that I have zero doubt that Roddenberry would have fought this show's creation tooth and nail had he been alive, I don't think the show is counter to Roddenberry's vision for Trek. And in many cases, it reinforces this optimistic future just as much as the original series and The Next Generation did. And as far as going into space or boldly going complaint, it's apparent to me that the showrunners were very much aware of this view and tried to counter it with the creation of the Bajoran wormhole to the Gamma Quadrant, which was their attempt to circumvent the issue by being stationary, so it would still allow them to explore the great unknown, as they were basically sitting on a doorway to the frontier that they could instantly take one to much further away than any Trek show has gone before. So our characters could go off exploring, or the unknown could come to them. And the one thing I noticed is the first season in particular tried to focus more on this aspect as a way to counter the complaint that Deep Space Nine isn't boldly going. However, I see this as a detriment to the first season, as later seasons would rely on this trope less and less and focus more on established characters and races, and I think the show was much better for it when they did. In fact, in later seasons, the wormhole would be closed off or off limits. Thus, they would completely eliminate this exploring the unknown aspect to the show altogether, and in my opinion, this only benefited the show. So one could even say that the first season was trying to be too much like The Next Generation, which is kind of understandable, as that was the main model they had to work off of at the time, and thus would end up emulating it perhaps a bit too much. And also, it was still currently airing when Deep Space Nine was released, and thus many viewers would judge it by Next Generation standards. In fact, as I touched on, many complained about the differences, which is perhaps why the next show, Voyager, would more closely resemble The Next Generation, which may have appeased the immediate fan base at large, but I feel it is what sets Deep Space Nine apart, and why Deep Space Nine has garnered a much larger, much more devoted fan base that prefers this show and would claim that this is the best Star Trek show. In any event, let me just go ahead and jump into the episodes of Season 1, starting with the series premiere, Emissary. So I've heard some praise this one as one of the better episodes of Deep Space Nine and the best pilot for any Star Trek series. I can't say that I really agree with either assessment, but would still say this is a good episode. I kind of have a split feelings about this episode. As for one, I love the fact that Deep Space Nine chose to initiate their series on what is very much a character story that fully explores Benjamin Sisko's character, and it does an amazing job doing so. No other Star Trek pilot has really done that. Kirk and Picard are happy and content in their positions when we first meet them, as is Janeway, although she is soon after thrust into a new troubling situation, but that was more of a situational crisis than a personal one. Here we meet Sisko, who is a very troubled man who lost his wife a few years ago and is raising a son alone, and is still harboring a lot of pain and resentment over the loss, to the point where he wants to resign from Starfleet and refuse the mission to Deep Space Nine. And this episode deals head-on with that in a spectacular way. As through his discovery of the ever-important Bajoran wormhole, he has to confront his inner demons head-on when the wormhole aliens force him to relive the events of his wife's death, and so he has to realize how much he is still affected by this, while at the same time establishing contact with an unusual alien species. This has a Star Trek tinge to it, but is uniquely Deep Space Nine, and thus this pilot does an amazing job of establishing exactly what kind of show this will be. I thought the scenes with Sisko talking to the wormhole aliens about the death of his wife were amazing and some of the most well-written, well-acted character scenes I've ever seen. And if this episode was just this storyline, I would give it a 9 or 10 and say it's easily the best Star Trek pilot and one of the best Deep Space Nine episodes. However, the episode isn't just this story, as we also get the introduction of Deep Space Nine and all the main cast members, and I was considerably less impressed with this storyline. In fact, I would often call this Pilot McPilot Face, the pilot, because it is so stereotypically a pilot episode, particularly the very clunky and obvious way some of these characters are introduced. And the fact that they feel the need to introduce all of the characters, which clearly there isn't enough time for, is a detriment to the episode. Most recent shows like Lost and Game of Thrones with an ensemble cast don't even try to introduce every single character in the first episode and slowly introduce all the characters over the first set of couple of episodes. But I suppose in the 90s things were a bit different, and this was probably done just as much for the studio as it was for the audience, so they would know who all the characters were. But we meet Kira and get clunky exposition on why she doesn't want the Federation there, which felt really fake and forced. We meet Bashir and get a couple of scenes that show how big of an idiot he is, and he's very flat and one-dimensional. We get a scene with Dax where she very quickly dumps exposition on who she is and what the Trill are. And the worst of all, we get Odo spouting exposition about his origins to Kira and how no one knows where he came from when it doesn't have anything to do with anything. He just all of a sudden brings it up. Oh, by the way, I'm a lone species and I don't know where it came from. That's great, Odo, but what the hell does that have to do with anything? It was some of the most unnatural dialogue I've ever seen. On top of that, the action sequences with the Cardassians attacking the station at the end of the episode were completely unnecessary, completely uninteresting, and were just a blatant, misguided, contrived attempt to bring action and suspense into the episode that showed Deep Space Nine can be badass. And it was just cringeworthy, as the episode would have been far better off had they just focused on Sisko's storyline. So taking all these things into consideration, I would say it's not as good as an episode as the Voyager pilot, and not one of the best episodes of the series. It's still a much stronger pilot than either Next Generation or Enterprise, but that's not a very high bar. So I'd say this is a pretty good episode, but not a great one. So, next episode is past Prologue, which was a very sloppy and poorly constructed attempt to explore the Bajoran internal politics and the conflict that exists between Sisko and Kira, and it just doesn't work. The show was still finding its footing and trying to establish the dynamic of the Bajor setting and the uneasy working relationship that exists between Sisko and his non-Starfleet first officer, who is native to the region, and it shows that they haven't really figured out how to do this yet. For example, I really didn't buy the thing with Kira going to the Admiral to complain about Sisko, and the Admiral, instead of being tactful about it, she calls Sisko to say, "That Bajoran that works for you interrupted a staff meeting to complain about you. I think you have a problem." I'm sorry, but what a bitch. First off, she's being racist by saying that Bajoran, and then bitches about her stupid staff meeting. Who the fuck cares about your staff meeting? I'm sorry, but that's not how I'd expect a Starfleet Admiral to behave. I would expect that she would handle it with a lot more tact and diplomacy. And of course, Sisko's response of, "Go over my head again and I'll have yours on a platter," is equally dickish, and I also don't buy it. And the whole plot with Tana was a piss-poor way to try to go into Kira's backstory. I'm not surprised that nothing established in this episode about Kira's past was ever mentioned again. Also, Tana's plan to destroy the Celestial Temple of the Prophets is so incredibly anti-Bajoran when he's supposed to be a hardliner. But again, this was kind of before that particular belief was really cemented in the show. And on top of that, we get a shameless cameo from Lursa and Bitor, which the producer screaming, "Hey, Next Generation fans, watch the show! Watch the show! There's cameos!" But the one saving grace of this episode was the introduction of Garrick. He's, of course, not as awesome at this stage, but his scenes were still great as plain, simple Garrick and his assistant to Bashir that he buy a suit at exactly 2055. And, of course, his insistence to Lursa and B'Etor that they haggle with him. That was great, too. So, overall, not that good of an episode. So next episode is A Man Alone, another example of Deep Space Nine trying to find its footing and just not getting it right. This one features an angry Simpsons mob that is just as realistic as the Simpsons screaming for Odo's head. I half expected someone in the mob to call out, "Think of the children! Won't someone think of the children?" And it even comes with a Scooby-Doo ending where Odo rips a mask off a man to reveal the real killer. Gasp! It was Uberdam all along, and he would have gotten away with it too if it wasn't for you rascally shapeshifters. Again, this established backstory on Odo that will promptly be ignored in the future, and for good reason. It was just a very clunky attempt to establish Odo's character that failed miserably. Also, as a side note, this features a scene of Bashir flirting with Dax, who blows him off, and both of these characters were completely and totally changed later on, so neither of them resemble the characters they would later become known for, and again, for very good reason. So this is a throwaway episode, not a very good one. So next episode is Babel, which is your stereotypical crew infected by a virus episode that you get on Star Trek, but with a Deep Space Nine twist. This episode was okay. Not the greatest thing ever, but it was certainly more entertaining than the previous two, and did a lot more to establish the character dynamics as we see the crew working together to overcome a crisis, rather than just focusing on just Bashir trying to find a cure. We also get Kira investigating its source, Cisco managing a quarantine that some try to violate, and Odo having to take over for the entire station after everyone succumbs to the virus. And the virus itself, I gotta say, was kind of funny, as it causes people to talk in gibberish, which was just so silly. It was actually entertaining, such as seeing Jake running around going, "Open way, Link! Open way!" And then people would just randomly spout out gibberish when they got stuck with the virus. Avery Brooks in particular was amazing when Cisco got stuck with the virus, because he was really overacting his speaking gibberish. Like Shatner would be proud. He's like, "Open the way, go!" Like he put like a lot of like drama into his voice. It was great. So this is a decent episode, but nothing to write home about. So next episode is Captive Pursuit, which is definitely the best episode of the series so far. The episode just comes together really nicely and works really well. I know in retrospect some may feel this has more of a Next Generation than a Deep Space Nine feel to it, and maybe so, but I still think it's a good episode and still had enough of a Deep Space Nine spin to it. In fact, I wish we had more episodes like this that explore strange aliens that come through the wormhole. This is something that was never really done that well into the first two seasons and kind of forgotten about in later seasons. So to my mind, this is the only episode that took real advantage of having Deep Space Nine sitting on the doorway to the unknown. The concept of the Tusk was just executed extremely well, because you don't really know what his deal is and why he's on edge, but you slowly learn that he's part of a culture bred to be prey, basically, for a species of hunters. And all the while you see Tusk begin to bond with O'Brien, and as O'Brien himself begins to think very highly of him. And this journey was so natural, so well executed, you could really feel the friendship form between these two people who just met each other from very different cultures. It was also well executed fish out of water story with an alien from a completely and totally different upbringing having to deal with life on Deep Space Nine, and O'Brien being his guide through it. And you could really feel for O'Brien. He felt responsible when he learned Tusk's life was ruined and he would live in disgrace because of it, so he defied orders to save him from it. And I totally bought that. And it was also great how Sisko on the surface was officially against what O'Brien did, but actually he didn't stop him when he could have, and ultimately O'Brien didn't really face any consequences for what he did. This was a nice step in Sisko's character and how he bonds with those who serve under him. The one complaint I had about this episode was that Tusk's refusal to tell O'Brien about who he is felt contrived and done simply out of plot convenience, as he had no real issue with telling him about it once he found out about it. And it's kind of frustrating when the show like pulls cliches like this, where, you know, a lot of things could have been solved or avoided had the characters actually just talk to each other. But that's no big deal. But I did like the scenes with Quark, which were really great, as this episode introduced O'Brien referring to him as Barkeep. It's a shame that they didn't keep this up. So all in all, I actually appreciate this episode a lot more than I have in the past on this rewatch, where I pay closer attention to analyze the episode, and I actually gotta say, I think this one really works. So the next episode is QLES, which when the show first came out was the episode I was most looking forward to, as there were articles in the TV Guide and Entertainment Weekly that promised that Q would appear on Deep Space Nine. And when the promos for this episode came out and revealed Vash would be involved as well, which had made me even more excited. However, when the episode came out, I was massively disappointed. I don't think this episode is terrible per se, it's just not interesting. It had a lot of potential, but it squandered all of it, as it could have explored interesting new dynamics of Q interacting with the Deep Space Nine crew, which would allow great ways to introduce the crew and get into it. But instead of doing that, it focused more on Vash having an auction for rare items and Q pining over her like some star-crossed ex-lover, which was just annoying to watch. We got like one good scene with Q and Sisko, but it didn't really go anywhere, and Q's other interactions with the crew felt forced and faked. Although this episode was too blatant in its Next Generation episodes, it was a bit sad. But the whole plot about the station being in danger because one of Vash's items turned out to be a life form trying to get back to the Gamma Quadrant was mildly entertaining. So this episode was fine. It was fine. So next episode after that is Dax. Now, a lot of people have already pointed out that this episode title is a bit misleading because we don't actually learn much about Dax. Now, I have to say, I did really enjoy the first part of the episode where those dudes tried to kidnap Dax and nearly got away, but Sisko managed to repair the tractor beam in time and caught them just before they left. However, once they came on board, they claimed the kidnapping was a legal extradition. I love how Sisko is able to stop them from taking Dax by bringing up the fact that they don't have an extradition treaty with Bajor, and the fact that these aliens were allied with the Cardassians annoys the Bajorans, so they would want to block them. It was great seeing Sisko and Kira team up to block these stupid aliens. It shows their relationship is really coming along. However, the episode goes downhill from there, where we get another example of a problem that could have been solved had Dax simply talked, and she refused to talk just so the plot could happen. No other reason. And even though I did love the Bajoran Arbiter, who was played by the old woman from Liar Liar, the trial itself was just one giant excuse to spout out exposition about the Trill, and some of the exposition about Sisko and Curzon's prior relationship. It was so blatant in that regard, I would even call it clunky. I really don't buy that the Trill wouldn't already have legal precedent established that states whether or not a new host is responsible for the crimes of a previous host. But again, if that were the case, which it should be, there'd be no plot. Now, the Trill themselves are established in this episode as being a truly joined entity, and the hosts have to go through vigorous trainings to become a joined Trill, and not all Trill are joined. And this, of course, is nothing like the way the Trill were established in the Next Generation, where the symbiote was shown to take over completely the host body. In fact, you did get the impression the host didn't even want to be joined. And plus, the Trill looked totally different. Apparently, the studio made them change the look of the Trill because it made Jadzia look too ugly, and they wanted the sex appeal of her looking smoking hot. So they went with spots instead, which didn't detract from her hotness. But to be honest, I didn't mind the way the Trill were presented in this episode. In fact, I think the concept of them being truly joined is much more interesting than the way they were presented in The Host. My main complaint is that they should have just came up with a new alien name and not called them the Trill, because for all intents and purposes, these are an entirely different alien, so why not just acknowledge it? I suppose they were worried fans would complain that they were too similar from the aliens from The Host, but I say that would be better than completely spitting on the face of all continuity, but whatever. But back to the episode, the reveal of the wife whom Dax had an affair with, and her reveal that her dead husband was the real traitor and not Dax, was meh, okay, I guess. So overall, it's an okay episode. Had a good start, but then it went into bland territory. So next episode we get is The Passenger. Now, a few years ago when I did my first version of my bottom 5 worst episodes of Deep Space Nine, I put this episode on it. But watching it again now, I don't think it's quite that bad. In fact, I wouldn't even say it's the worst of Season 1. It does have some interesting aspects to it, like it does become somewhat interesting suspense thriller with a killer who apparently is an expert at cheating death, and an investigator who knows him intimately and knows that he's still alive when everyone else thinks he's dead. And it was also interesting seeing Quark actually arrange mercenaries to raid a ship. I don't think we ever see him something do so blatantly violent in the future. And I actually do like the interaction between Odo and Lieutenant Prenham, and the pissing contest of being head of security, and how Sisko tells Prenham off and puts him in his place and tells him to trust Odo. But Prenham does prove himself useful by figuring out Vandika's next move. But the reason why I singled this out as a particularly bad episode is because the mystery was the most obvious thing in the world. Once it was revealed that the bad guy could transfer his consciousness into someone else, you knew immediately it was Bashir, even though all of the characters on the screen just assumed it was the investigator, which was really annoying because you knew they were all wrong. Also, the abrupt way that these new aliens are introduced without any proper explanation or any sort of backstory with them, it felt very alienating to me, and it distanced me from the story. But the main reason why I held this episode up as a horrible episode is Alexander Siddig's performance as the bad guy who was in control of Bashir was just shockingly bad. It was just awful. And I could not take it seriously, not for a single second. He just talked really slowly and unnaturally. And it was perhaps the worst performance on any Star Trek show to date. So yeah, even though I no longer would say this is one of the worst of the series, I do recognize it does have some redeemable qualities, but I still say it's not a good episode at all. So, next episode is Move Along Home, which is generally considered one of the worst, if not the worst episode of Deep Space Nine, and this common opinion frankly baffles me. I always liked this episode, and at the time I first saw it, I considered it one of my favorite episodes of the season. Now granted, there had only been 9 episodes at this stage, and while I wouldn't say this episode is great by any means, I still have a good fun time watching it, and I don't think it at all deserves all of the hate that it gets, which even though I have watched several videos from several YouTubers trashing it, I still don't get why people don't like it. I did my own review on this episode where I go into more detail about this that you can check out if you want to hear me elaborate more about this. I mean, I do get the absurdness of this episode, and there are some plot holes that I myself had pointed out in the review, but I don't think it's terrible. There's some great moments in this episode, like Quark groveling on the ground yelling, "Please!" or Avery Brooks hopscotching and saying, "Oliver Rain, come with me." I mean, come on. That was amazing. I love to watch this episode again just to see that. But my favorite part, which I still love and I get a kick out of every time I see it, is when Odo wants to beam aboard the Wadi ship and Brennan is like, "Oh, you just can't go beaming over to other people's ships without the permission." And Odo is like, oh, is that a Starfleet rule?" And Brennan was like, "Yeah." And then Odo goes, "Yeah, but I'm not in Starfleet." I love that. That's amazing. And I always thought that this was a fun episode. But yes, it does have a lot of flaws. So I wouldn't say it's great by any means. It's just good. But certainly not bad. Anyway, next episode is The Nagus. And to be honest, I never knew what to make of this episode. This episode was the first in a tradition of doing Quark-centric Ferengi episodes that had a drastically different tone because it was a much more comedic nature. I believe when I first saw this episode, I was very off-put by the drastic change in tone and the focus on the Ferengi, a race I was never really cared that much about. But in retrospect, I think I appreciate this episode a lot more. The Ferengi were first introduced in The Next Generation as the main adversary, but were abandoned in favor of the Romulans when they failed miserably in that role. But in later seasons of The Next Generation, they would appear in a more comic relief roles. But I think this is the first episode that really established them as a completely comedic rather than menacing species. This episode did a lot to flesh out the culture by introducing their leader, their system of government, and other cultural traits such as vacuum sealing the dead of well-known Ferengis to auction them off, and that the typical education is seen as undesirable, and of course, and they might have mentioned in the previous episode, but this episode really gets more into the rules of acquisition. And as I said, in retrospect, this was quite fascinating as it lays the groundwork for what the Ferengi are to become, and Deep Space Nine does do an amazing job of fleshing out this race, turning them into from a failed villain into a viable, established staple that enriches the overall Star Trek universe. And this episode in particular was not bad, as it shows Quark dealing with becoming the Nagus and all that entails. And of course it introduces Wallace Shawn as the Grand Nagus, who is a great actor. I actually didn't recognize him at first with all the makeup on, and I actually didn't believe it when someone told me it was the inconceivable guy from The Princess Bride, but later I found out it was. And also, even though Morn has appeared in the background at Quark's ever since the pilot episode, this is the first episode that starts to really establish Morn as a regular barfly, as when Quark closes the bar to have the Ferengi conference, Morn tries to get into the bar anyway, and Quark has to shoo him away. I love that. I thought it was hilarious. And I love Morn. He's great. In fact, in this episode, you actually hear him aloud as he laughs aloud at one of Quark's jokes. It's not the same thing as speaking, but you do hear him make noises, which I think this is the only time it ever happened. And I actually like the B-plot of this episode about Sisko thinking that Jake is up to no good with Nog as he sneaks out late at night, so he follows him only to discover that he's helping Nog learn to read in secret because his father won't let him. And so Sisko realizes that things aren't always what they appear, and he appreciates his son as a good person. That was actually quite touching. But this episode does have some drawbacks. Sometimes the Ferengi humor is over the top and is more annoying than funny. And the plot that Rom and Krax had to kill Quark was more cartoonish than it was suspenseful. And the reveal that the Nagus didn't die and it was all a ploy to see if his son was ready was really contrived and unbelievable. And of course, watching the episode in retrospect, there's a lot of inconsistencies with later seasons, such as Rom's behavior is absolutely nothing like how they would make this character in the future, and Zek's son, Krax, would mysteriously vanish after this episode, never be spoken of again, kind of like Armin Tanzarian. Not that I really mind these reactions, as I think it's all for the better. It's still a bit jarring seeing this episode, though, and it illustrates inconsistencies in the show. So this is a pretty good episode, all things considered, but nothing great. So, next episode is Vortex, which is a very meh episode. It's not horrible, it's not offensive, but it's not very memorable either. This episode, again, suffers from thrusting in new characters and alien species without giving them a proper introduction. For me personally, that makes it hard for me to care about what happens to them, and it feels like I've joined the story halfway through. The episode also suffers from playing off of Odo's origins and how he doesn't know where he came from, which in retrospect, once you know his origins, kind of takes all the interest out of this episode. Not that it was all that interesting to begin with. In fact, in Season 3, when they revealed Odo's origins, the actor who plays Odo said that he was against this at first, as he thought it would ruin his character and wanted the mystery to remain unsolved. I completely disagree with that. In fact, I would point to this episode as an example of how tedious it would be to watch Odo constantly wonder about his origins. But all that being said, this episode wasn't bad. Like, the storyline with the Myrmidon trying to get revenge for his dead twin was suspenseful, and I did really enjoy the strange relationship that had developed between Odo and Croden, and how they slowly learned to trust and respect each other. And I liked the reveal that Croden was being truthful and about his having a daughter that he was trying to protect from a corrupt government, and Odo's decision to set them free was very touching. Also, this is the first time we hear Odo's species referred to as changelings, which hints at a bigger mythology involving the changelings throughout the Gamma Quadrant, which makes a lot of sense when the nature of the changelings is revealed. So that works too. But again, it's not a great episode, but not a horrible, so it's fine. It's fine. So next we get Battle Lines. Now, when this episode first came out, it was my favorite episode of the show, and indeed, even deep into the second and third season, I still consider this one of the better episodes of the show overall. However, as time passed, I come to think less fondly of this episode as I realized that I was more impressed with the concept of this episode than I was with the execution, and thus was trying to convince myself that it was better than it is. Now, what's noteworthy of this episode is that it guest stars Jonathan Banks as the NS leader Shelah. Banks, of course, has become very well known in recent times for playing Mike Ehrmantraut on Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul. But the thing is, I was already aware of him, and I knew him by name when I first saw this episode, as I recognized him from a movie I used to like. What can I say? I was young, called Free Jack. So he was an attraction for me to begin with, and I thought he added a lot to the episode and did an amazing job. Now, the episode itself has a very interesting premise about the runabout crashing on a planet that turns out to be a penal colony where no one can die, and yet has two sides locked in an eternal war. And this allows a lot of great character beats and thoughtful reflections about the futility of eternal hate and yet the difficulty of forgiveness. And I like what they did with Kaiopaka in this episode, as I think it really subverts expectations, as she was presented at the start of the series as this huge hope for Bajor, and then this episode just takes her off the table, which will allow them to explore the chaos left behind by her absence in Season 2. But as far as this episode goes, it allows them to explore her character as she simply accepts that her true purpose isn't on Bajor and her work is to try to make peace between these bitter enemies, which is a difficult task indeed. And I will say there has been some non-canon novels that has showed what happened, and that Opaka eventually does make peace between the two sides, and they both work together to find a way to subvert the nanites, and they find a way to leave the Gamma Quadrant, leave the planet and go back to the Alpha Quadrant, but that's digressing. Anyway, I like her with Kira, the scene with her and Kira. It was kind of a microcosm of her work to come, as it shows her getting Kira to make peace with her violent past. Although that scene did feature some horrific acting from Nana Visitor, who I don't think is a bad actor overall, which I'll get to more shortly. But her performance here, for whatever reason, was just awful. And throughout the episode, she's quite bad as well. But I also really enjoyed Bashir's discovery that if you die on this planet, even though you come back to life, it means that you can never leave the planet again, otherwise you die for good. And that was really suspenseful, and it raised the stakes. And I love the final solution where Sisko just had to leave them to their fate. But as I said, I still don't think they did enough with this episode, and it wasn't quite as good as it could have been. And the B plot with O'Brien and Dax searching for them was just full of technobubble nonsense and was quite tedious. And it's one of the rare examples of Deep Space Nine where they do that. So that brings the episode down a bit as well. But overall, I would still say that this is a pretty good episode. Just not one of the best. So next episode is the Storyteller. And this episode isn't looked on too fondly either, because the main plot about a monster terrorizing a Bajoran village that turns out to be the manifestation of the villagers' fears was awful. There's no denying this. Again, the villagers in this episode came off as two-dimensional, cliche, stereotype idiots with no depth, and the main story about the Storyteller naming O'Brien as his successor as a ploy to get his apprentice to step up was so dumb. I just did not buy it on any level. But all that being said, this episode actually wasn't horrible because a few things saved it. First of all, this is the beginning of O'Brien and Bashir's friendship, and I think it all starts off in an interesting way with O'Brien basically not liking Bashir, and Bashir is trying a bit too hard to get him to like him. I think the writers recognized the chemistry that they had in this episode and very wisely decided to build off of that. It does feature a hilarious line that I used to quote all the time when O'Brien attempts to be the storyteller and just gets up and says, "Once upon a time there was a Balrog and it's there." I love that. It cracks me up. Also, I think the B plot actually saves this episode a bit as well. It's probably my favorite side story with Jake and Nog, as we see them pining after a Bajoran leader who's a young girl around their age who is trying to start a war. I really like that storyline, and overall, I think both storylines did what Trek rarely does, which I appreciate, as most planets or cultures are portrayed as kind of monocultural, like all Vulcan or all of Kronos is basically one culture. But this shows that Bajor is similar to Earth of modern times, in which there exists an abundance of different cultures and societies, some of whom don't get along or have very different customs. And I like that. I think it fleshed out the series a lot more, and it gave it a more realistic feel to it. But don't get me wrong, it's still a bad episode. I don't think it's the most terrible thing ever, but it's not a good episode. So, next episode after that is Progress. And I gotta be honest, I never liked this episode. This may have to do with my personal taste, but I found the main guest character of Mullabach extremely annoying, and every time he appeared on my screen, I wanted him off of my screen. I did not find him charming or homely or anything like that, which was clearly the intent. I just found him to be a stubborn old dick whom I did not care about at all. and I found the stakes with Kira's career being at risk to be really contrived and forced. Basically, it was fake stakes that I didn't buy, and I see this as the episode's failed attempt to create tension in this episode. And I do see that it tries to build a character arc for Kira, and to be honest, I do think parts of it worked. But overall, I was just bored. And if I were to point to a single episode in the entire 7 seasons run of Deep Space Nine that most represents boring, I would point to this episode. Now, I did kind of like her interactions with Sisko and how he gets her to see reason. I think that's an important development in their relationship, and I like the concept of Kira having to deal with being the authority that takes down the underdog when she's used to being the underdog. But I still didn't buy the whole story of the stubborn old man refusing to leave. I just have no interest in that. In fact, I'd say I actually preferred the B story with Jake and Nog trading Yamak sauce for stem bolts for land, but even that storyline wasn't that interesting, particularly on a binge watch, because we get a lot of these B plots with Jake and Nog in episode after episode, and they get up to shenanigans, so the whole concept is starting to wear very thin by the time we get to this episode. But I wouldn't say this isn't the worst episode ever. It does have some good qualities, but overall I just don't like it, and I think it's boring at best and annoying at worst. Anyway, so next episode is If Wishes Were Horses. And I feel about this episode the same way most people feel about Move Along Home. And so much as I think it's terrible, it's horrible, it has no redeeming qualities whatsoever. I don't even know where to begin with just how horrible this episode is. Okay, so let's start with the fact that this is a high concept episode. Kind of like, the crew grows old, or the crew grows young, or the crew gets small, or etc., etc. These are the types of episodes are never good, as they're more fitting for like kids' cartoons than they are for cerebral sci-fi shows. This episode in particular used a concept that has specifically been done in Star Trek several times before, be it shore leave or imaginary friend, but most of all, this episode seems like a direct ripoff of the first season Next Generation episode where no one has gone before, or at least the part where the crew was in that place where what they imagined would turn into reality. And frankly, this episode doesn't do it nearly as good as that episode did. And it's a really sad state of affairs when you say that an episode feels like a pale shadow and nowhere near as good as a Next Generation first season episode. As in nowhere where no one has gone before, at least the rules of how people's imaginations appear was more consistent. Here the rules seem to make no sense. Buck Bokai, Rumpelstiltskin, and the horny Dax just stick around for the whole episode, whereas other people phase in and out, and sometimes it's mostly people and sometimes it's things. There's no consistency, and that's not how imagination works. People imagine things in and out, so it makes no sense that these three people would just stick around the whole entire time, particularly Rumpelstiltskin, whom O'Brien clearly did not want around, or the horny Dax, which Bashir definitely didn't want around, as it was really embarrassing for him. Oh, and speaking of that, did I mention, by the way, that this episode has Rumpel-frickin-Stiltskin in it? I mean, this episode gave a fairy tale gnome running around the station, sitting on ops, while the crew is trying to deal with techno-babble nonsense. It has to be the dumbest thing I have ever seen. Although, I did hear that originally, instead of Rumpelstiltskin, they wanted to have a leprechaun. But Colmini outright refused, saying it was stereotyping Irish culture to an extreme as to be offensive. And I have to agree. But I love the fact that the writers of this episode were that bad, they were that clueless, they were that dumb that they tried to have a leprechaun roaming the station following O'Brien around. And honestly, I wish they would have done that. Because if they would have done that, at the very least, this episode would have a so bad it's good quality to it. And would actually be fun to watch because you could see that the writers were either idiots or simply weren't trying, to the point of being offensive. But, as it stands, there's no enjoyment in this episode to be had whatsoever. I mean, not only is the premise stupid, the execution sucks as well. The interactions between the characters and their various fantasies, conjurings were so fake and forced and cliched, it didn't seem natural at all, and rather than develop the characters, develop the characters more, like I heard some people claim it did, it actually went against their characters in many cases. And on top of that, the threat of the week was so predictable. I mean, I figured out it was their own imagination causing this BS anomaly thingy like 15 minutes through the episode, but it took these idiots like to the end of the episode to figure it out. And the whole time you're just thinking, oh, come on! It's so obvious, idiots! And the whole reason that the aliens just stopped by, and brought people's imaginations to life was just a way of exploring humanity. Felt like a cheap attempt to imitate the original series. It was just cringeworthy. And when I'm not putting the original series down, but a cheap attempt to do what it did is bullshit. As I said, the whole episode is horrible, terrible episode with no redeemable qualities whatsoever, and it is definitely one of the worst of the entire show. So, next we get another horrible episode that's not much better with The Forsaken. This episode isn't bad just because Luoxana Troy is in it, but that certainly doesn't help matters. But it's overall just a really bad episode. Luoxana Troy was a huge blemish on The Next Generation, and in contrast to Q, when I first heard that Luoxana was going to guest on Deep Space Nine, I was dreading it. And indeed, the storyline with her falling in love with Odo and chasing after him to the point of being completely oblivious to the very obvious fact that he wanted nothing to do with her was just a rehash of several very bad TNG episodes like Manhunt. And again, when something is a rehash of something that wasn't good in the first place, that's a very bad sign. But it's not just the ridiculousness of that. The episode features several storylines of them being stupid. In addition, we get a plot of O'Brien struggling with the Cardassian computer until an alien probe comes from the Gamma Quadrant and makes the computer have a nice personality, but then it comes attached to O'Brien like a puppy and always finds excuses to bring him back to the computer. Not only is the story concept ridiculous, it's also bad execution, as the scenes with the computer being difficult were so fake and forced and inconsistent with what we've seen of how the computer behaves so far. Like this being such a dick to O'Brien was just came out of nowhere for this episode. And their solution of finding a little folder to keep the alien program in where it won't interfere with the station functions, but still O'Brien will give it the attention it needs is pretty dumb. And when O'Brien told Sisko, oh, don't worry, I'll make sure the alien program gets all the attention it needs so it won't interfere with operations again, I thought to myself, oh, don't worry, Sisko, this will never ever be mentioned in the show ever again. And on top of these two bad storylines, we get another subplot that is arguably even worse, about Bashir encountering three very stereotypical grumpy and annoying ambassadors around, and he thinks it will ruin his career, but he ends up saving their lives in a very choreographed and fake way. When Sisko and Kira arrive to escort the ambassadors out of the fire safely, they took the time to pause, and he preys on Bashir, and I like this young man, I'm going to give him a promotion. It was so fake. I think they'd be more concerned about getting medical attention. In addition, the whole way they were behaving throughout the episode was the very definition of contrived, as it didn't come off as natural or realistic at all and felt very fake and forced. The one saving grace of this episode that stops it from getting a 1 is you do get more information on Odo's backstory, such as learning about a scientist with a similar haircut that raised him, and I like that. That was well done and really fleshed out his character. Plus, the way that Luoxana was understanding and got Odo to open up surprisingly actually worked. But don't get me wrong, this episode still sucks. A lot. Anyway, so let's get on to the next episode with is Germanness persona. I really wanted to like this episode as it has an interesting concept, and I think I even let myself be convinced that this was a good episode, but when I look at this episode objectively, I have to admit it's not very good. It's about a mutiny story with Kira and Sisko, and typically I love mutiny stories. They're always my favorite, which is why I wanted to like this episode so much. But the way it was executed simply didn't work, as it has like an alien telepathic disease infect the senior officers to have them play out a mutiny and alter their behaviors. Yet, there was very conveniently already a situation in place on the station that created tension between Sisko and Kira, and although everyone was acting strangely, they still interpreted aspects of their real life into this conflict in a way that I simply didn't buy. And it was too convenient for these telepathic disease or whatever that caused civil conflict that there was already an existing conflict between two different groups in place here. The scene where Kira tries to seduce Jadzia felt really odd, and like the producers just threw it in there to amp up the sex appeal. To me, using a telepathic disease was a cop-out, and would have been much more interesting had the conflict been genuine, such as like the conflict between Janeway and Chakotay's disagreement and Scorpion. But that being said, there were some things about this episode I did like, such as the fact that Odo was the one person not affected by it, and that he was trying to manage both sides who were acting strange while trying to find a cure for them. And that was interesting. That was actually a suspenseful through line. And I also love the scene where Quark comes in with a neck brace after Kira threw him against the wall and he wants to sue her. That is so typical Quark. It was amazing. And I love that that's the thing that indicates to Odo that Quark isn't affected by the telepathic disease, because he is definitely acting like himself. And of course, there's also Avery Brooks over-the-top acting in this episode, which I absolutely love. Give me a phaser! I'll take care of Kira! I love that so much. He does crazy so well. There's one line of his I used to quote a lot to my brother, and that is when he makes like this strange thing and Odo asks what it is. He asks Odo what he thinks of it, and Odo's just like, oh, what is it? And he says, a clock! I love that, especially Odo's reaction where he's like physically taken aback by it. He cracks me up every time. I used to say that to my brother all the time when this first came out, and every time I talked about a clock, and I'd be like, a clock! In fact, I remember later that year, my aunt gave me a clock for Christmas, and so when I was unwrapping it on Christmas Day and my brother asked me what it was, I very gleefully said, a clock! It was the best Christmas present I ever got. Anyway, this episode did have some positive aspects to it, but overall, not a good episode. So, let's move over to the next episode, which is Duet. And I've been very vocal on my channel about how much I love this episode. On several occasions, I called it the best episode of Deep Space Nine, and several other occasions, I called it the best episode of the entire Star Trek franchise. I'm not going to commit to either of those statements here until I rewatch the rest of Deep Space Nine. I want to give the whole series a fair shake, but damn, I love this episode. It gets me every time. As I often say, I'm always more impressed by stories that manage to be engaging, suspenseful, and emotionally powerful just by focusing on two people in a room talking to each other. To me, that's very impressive. Has using special effects, action pieces, beautiful landscapes, or fancy cinematography is too much of a crutch. So I'm always a lot more impressed when the story can be fantastic without any of those gimmicks. This episode in particular is amazing exploration of examination of Major Kira, her past as a terrorist, her present as a devoted Bajoran administrator working with the Federation, and it features very powerful character growth as she's forced to question her prejudice against Cardassians. In fact, this episode is amazing at exploring prejudice and prejudgments, as it shows how destructive doing so can be. Now, I won't go into too much detail here, as I could talk for hours about this episode. In fact, I did do a full-length review of this episode, so if you want to hear more of my thoughts on this episode, you can check that out. But suffice to say here, I think this episode is damn near perfect. The chemistry between Kira and Maritza was amazing. Harris Yulin, who played Maritza, gave an outstanding Shakespearean type performance, which was just incredible. However, I recently heard several opinions that Nana Visitor's acting was poor in comparison, overshadowed by Yulin, but I personally disagree. I thought she did an amazing job as well. In fact, I would say this was her best performance in the entire show. She really did portray how seething with anger she was, and just how disturbed she was by this mass murderer who bragged about being a mass murderer. And of course, her realization at the end that Maritza was actually an honorable man, her reaction to this was also amazingly acted. And it wasn't just Kira. A lot of characters had great moments, such as Sisko having to juggle the Cardassians and the Bajoran, pulling him in opposite directions on what to do with Maritza. And the scene where Kira convinces Sisko to let her conduct the interrogation was amazing and crucial to their character development. We also see Gul Dukat for the first time since the pilot episode, and his interactions with Odo are hinting at an uneasy past between them was also amazing, and was great stepping stones for the rest of the show to build off of this relationship. I used to go around quoting this episode when I was a teenager, where I could actually recite, at the very least, the interrogation scenes between Kira and Maritza word for word, like off the top of my head. I was just so enamored with this episode, and watching it again recently, it still manages to move me and has not lost any of its power, even though I have seen it dozens of times by now. I still am a cry at the end of it. I'm still emotionally affected by it, so it's still an outstanding, amazing, standout episode. Powerful commentary, probably some of the best that Star Trek has ever done, and one of my favorite pieces of fiction in any medium of all time. Anyway, so we finally come to the season finale, In the Hands of the Prophets. When I first saw this episode, I wasn't impressed with it for several reasons. First of all, I saw it as a step down from what I considered a masterpiece, Duet. And secondly, this was this season finale, so I was kind of expecting a Next Generation style grand finale, like a cliffhanger spectacle. I remember this episode aired the same week as the Next Generation Season 6 finale, Descent, which I was super excited for, as that was the next big Borg action adventure. And then there was this episode, which was just about some religious dudes coming to the station acting like dicks. And so I was a lot less interested in that concept. However, ironically, looking back on this episode, I think of it much more highly than I do Descent. And when I judge the episode for what it is, I recognize it's actually quite good. I think I was originally off-put by the fact that it wasn't really Next Generation-like and had a totally different style, but in retrospect I see that as a huge positive. It is very true to Trek, however, by making very strong social commentary about the interference of religious extremism can have on education and can hamper education and promote ignorance. And I love how Vedic Gwen is portrayed as someone who actually doesn't care about what she's saying publicly and really is just using it as a ploy to grab more power, because I do think that is a really true to life reflection of what happens in real life. But more than that, this is when Deep Space Nine first really starts to strike out on its own and not just be another version of the Next Generation, as it starts to build its own mythology, as it starts to build and set up that they have talked about before, about how they have Opaka being the only thing holding Bajor together, and then her being taken out of the equation is going to create a power vacuum, and this episode starts to show us the consequences of that vacuum, which will be explored more in Season 2. And while, yes, Vedic Win is annoying, and sometimes I wish she would just go away, I do think she is in fact a very apt villain who works well in representing realistically the type of people who would exist in situations like the one presented in the show with Bajor. I also really like how Kira goes on a journey in this episode, and she's extremely resentful because of it. Because at first, Kira actually starts out supporting Kai Wynn, but then realizes at the end that she's been duped. And that's really interesting, especially those of who have seen the entire 7 seasons and know that throughout most of the series, Kira and Wynn are like very strong enemies and hate each other. So it's interesting to look back and watch this episode where she was actually supportive of her at first before she realized what a fraud she actually is. And the story about the murder mystery and the reveal that it was O'Brien's assistant all along, that was okay. Not the best, but it was kind of interesting. There were a few places in this episode I thought the story dragged and wasn't all that interesting, so I wouldn't say that this is a great episode. In particular, there was the ending where Neela was about to assassinate Baral, and they went a bit overboard with this scene, with like playing this really dramatic music, and had Cisco charge at her in slow motion going, "No!" That was a bit cheesy. And in fact, watching it now, it cracks me up. It was comically bad. But overall, still an interesting episode. I like what it has to say, and I like the way it says it. So, all in all, it's a strong episode to end, a strong way to end the season. So that is it. That is all the episodes of Season 1. So now, let me get into my favorite and least favorite episodes of the season, or what in my opinion is the best and the worst episode of the season. So let's start with the worst episode of the season, where there are a lot of options, like A Man Alone, The Passenger, The Storyteller, Progress, and The Forsaken. But the very clear worst episode for me is If Wishes Were Horses. As I said, this episode has no redeemable qualities whatsoever. It does everything wrong. It's a cheap, second-grade imitation of something we've seen in Trek dozens of times before. The dialogue is poorly written. The suspense is contrived. The characters are out of character. Oh, and by the way, it has Rumple frickin' Stiltskin running around this goddamn station threatening to take O'Brien's daughter away. Ah! This episode's horrible. Anyway, now to move on to the best episode of the season. Sure, I could bring up Captive Pursuit, Battle Lions, and In the Hands of the Prophets, but come on. It's not even close. Duet absolutely blows everything else out of the water. This episode is a masterpiece in my opinion. It has some amazing acting, amazing character moments, amazing dialogue, some really chilling moments as it deals with what appears to be a genuinely evil man. It also fleshes out the world a lot, bringing a huge stepping stone for Deep Space Nine to differentiate itself from other Star Trek shows, and add to that, it has a mystery suspense storyline. It's totally engaging while just mostly being a dialogue-based episode. And it makes some very powerful commentary about hate and those unable to forgive and how things aren't always as they appear to be. As I said, an absolute masterpiece. Anyway, as for my rating for Deep Space Nine Season 1 as a whole, out of 10, is going to be a 6 good. I'll be honest, this season without Duet would get a 4. But Duet elevates this season that much on its own. It is that good. But even without Duet, I wouldn't say it's that bad, as it often gets compared to the first season of The Next Generation, but even without Duet, I don't think it's anywhere near as bad as that. There are a lot of positive things about the season, and those who have seen the entire show will notice a lot of important building blocks of what Deep Space Nine will become in later seasons. But there was a run of really bad episodes, and it was obvious at this stage the show didn't really know what it wanted to be yet, and was leaning too heavily on the Next Generation crutch, but it did really find its footing with those last 2 episodes and have some sprinkles of good storytelling throughout the season, so it was good. So that's it for my review of Star Trek Deep Space Nine Season 1. I will be back at the start of each month with my review of each season of Deep Space Nine and my continuing mission to cover every episode of Deep Space Nine one season at a time. I also do many other videos on Star Trek as well, and I also cover other shows like Game of Thrones, The Expanse, Better Call Saul, and more, so be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. Thanks a lot for watching.